earliest antibiotics are natural. These were discovered in a mold growing on a petri dish by Dr. Fleming back in the late 1800s. So penicillin, being one of the earliest antibiotics discovered, is a perfectly natural phenomenon. And this is something that is sometimes forgotten when people talk about antibiotic resistance and the environment, and isn't it such a horrible thing? Without these early antibiotics being discovered, we would have lost millions more soldiers in World War II, probably. Penicillin was seen as a tremendous discovery. There was a president, Calvin Coolidge, whose son died from a blister that he developed on his foot while playing tennis. And these are the types of things that happened before we had antibiotics. So you can imagine how miraculous this discovery was. That's what we have to remember. This is a natural phenomenon. Antibiotics are natural. Antibiotic resistance is also natural. Resistant bacteria and antibiotic resistance genes have been isolated from caves 250 meters below the surface of the earth that have never had exposure to recycled water. Looking at some of these ice cores that they're pulling out of the Arctic, 120,000 years old, they're finding resistant bacteria and resistance genes. And so we know that this is a natural phenomenon that predated our ability to make it worse. Why resistance is a natural phenomenon is a $1 million question. Nobody really knows, but it's thought that this has to do with bacteria competing for resources in the environment, where one bacterium will find a carbon as a food source and say, I want that carbon, and they'll produce an antibiotic to keep the other bacteria away. And the other bacteria say, no, I want that carbon, and they develop resistance. Now, that covers millions of years of evolution. So I'm way oversimplifying it, but that is the current thinking of why antibiotic resistance developed naturally. Environmental antibiotic resistance is something that has entered our realm of thinking in the last few years because we use a lot of antibiotics in agriculture as well as in the clinics. And when we use an antibiotic for agricultural clinical use, about 75% of that antibiotic is excreted through urine and feces, either unaltered or as antibiotic metabolites. This doesn't mean that they're being overprescribed in a single animal, but it's more that when an antibiotic is prescribed, if you have an infection in one part of your body, enough antibiotic has to be prescribed so that the dose reaches that area. So very often the body is flooded with antibiotics, and because of that, there is a large amount that is actually excreted after use. When these antibiotics are excreted by humans and by animals, very often the waste ends up in wastewater treatment plants. And many wastewater treatment plants are not designed for complete removal of antibiotics. And so then when the water leaves the wastewater treatment plant as recycled water or as fertilizer, biosolids, a lot of these antibiotics still remain there in the product and enter the environment. Water environments are an excellent unifying transmission pathway between the environment, humans, and animals. We all use water every single day. There are areas in the United States that are becoming increasingly dependent on recycled wastewater, Arizona being one of those states that is highly dependent on recycled wastewater. It has been proposed that using wastewater for irrigation, using recycled wastewater to create wetlands, etc., it's been proposed that this is a key source of resistance entry into the environment and into the human food chain. And this may be true, but this is not the only source of resistance into the environment. So it's actually much more complicated than that. I started studying antibiotic resistance in water It was probably about 2005. And one of the things that I was hearing in the press, it was saying that our use of recycled water is making antibiotic resistance so much worse because we're pouring this recycled water into the environment and it's filled with these resistance genes. And so we're just exacerbating the problem terribly. And at the time, in Arizona, we were hearing about something called direct potable reuse, meaning Arizona was starting to examine the possibility that we could take water into the recycled water treatment plant and sanitize it to the point where it could then be used for drinking, directly for drinking. So I started thinking, is this such a good idea if this water is going to have these resistance genes in it? So I started looking at this from an environmental perspective. And one of my earliest studies that lasted for about 10 years was at the Gilbert Riparian Preserve in Gilbert, Arizona. So in Gilbert, they have created a wetland, and every day for the last nearly 30 years, they have filled these drainage basins with recycled water. And the recycled water then trickles down into the groundwater and can be then reused for irrigation. It can be cleaned for human consumption, etc. But I thought, if it's true that irrigation with recycled municipal wastewater induces antibiotic resistance, this is a perfect place to study it because they are putting recycled water into this wetland every single day. So what I did is, over a period of many years, I went and I collected sediment cores from these basins. I also collected sediment cores from a pond in Arizona that had no exposure to recycled water. That was my control site. So I had very interesting findings from this study. Interesting and confounding and frustrating because the results went against some of my earliest hypotheses. So what I found is that when we looked at the reclaimed water recharge sediments, I found that about 40% of the bacteria that I analyzed did not have any antibiotic resistance. About 50% were resistant to between 1 and 3 antibiotics. So I was using cultural methods and exposing these bacteria to the actual antibiotics, to 16 different antibiotics, to figure out which ones they were resistant to. So about 50% of the recycled water sediments had bacteria that were resistant to 1 to 3 antibiotics. A smaller number, about 10%, a little less than 10%, were resistant to 4 to 6 antibiotics. Now that's getting up to be a pretty high level of resistance. And about 3% were resistant to 7 or more antibiotics. This is where we'd have a lot of concern from the clinical realm about these bacteria that are resistant to so many different antibiotics. So then, of course, I want to look at the control site, and my hypothesis was that we were going to find nearly no resistance from the control site. And you can probably guess from what I've said so far what we actually found. I found that in the control sites that had never had any exposure to recycled wastewater is that about 7% of bacteria were not resistant to any antibiotics, and compare that to the 40% that were not resistant in recycled water. Well, that's interesting. But then when I thought about the levels of resistance, I figured it's going to be far lower, of course, in the control sites. And that's not what I found at all. I found that about 60% compared to 50% of the recycled water, 60% of the control bacteria were resistant to 1 to 3 antibiotics. About 30% of the control bacteria were resistant to 4 to 6 antibiotics, and twice the number of bacteria from the groundwater recharge sites were resistant to 7 or more antibiotics. So this natural pristine site had levels of antibiotic resistance that were far, far higher than those that we isolated from the reclaimed water sites. Now, why? Why are we seeing this? I was completely confounded and, as I said, very frustrated with this data. While I was, playing around or trying to decipher this data, I went to a meeting and ran into a researcher from Israel. And we began to talk about our research results, and lo and behold, he had found the same thing in Israel. And we looked at each other and said, what does this mean? When a bacterium in the environment carries antibiotic resistance, it's what we call metabolically expensive. It has to carry all this excess DNA that otherwise it wouldn't need. But since it needs antibiotic resistance, it's carrying all this excess DNA. And so bacteria in the environment are kind of living on the edge. There's never enough water. There's not enough carbon for them to live on. So carrying excess DNA would be somewhat problematic. But bacteria have this wonderful capability of shedding genes that they don't need. And so what we're thinking is adding this recycled water to the wetland was enhancing the soil carbon. All of a sudden, the bacteria have all the food and water that they need and may have been able to shed those resistance genes. A really exciting finding. We have not yet followed up on this question, but the fact that it was found in two areas with similar soils, very sandy, very low carbon, very arid soils, seems to me that this is a valid hypothesis that needs to be studied. So what it also says is antibiotic resistance everywhere, not only in the environment, but especially in the environment, it's not a direct cause and effect. Meaning we may be adding these resistance genes into the environment with the recycled water, but does it directly cause the development of antibiotic resistance? Well, from this data, we can see it's not true. It's actually much more complicated than this. And so what this study, mine as well as the one in Israel, what it does show is that we need highly controlled research studies that consider antibiotic resistance from a One Health perspective. Environmental antibiotic resistance is in soil, in water, in plants. What we eat every day is probably covered in antibiotic resistance genes. It is increasing everywhere, but definitely in the environment due to human activity. So I don't mean to say that environmental resistance is not something that we need to worry about. We do need to worry because we are making the problem far worse. Environmental antibiotic resistance is hazardous to humans, to animals. Right now here in Arizona, we are experiencing monsoon winds. So you can breathe in the dust in the air and be breathing in antibiotic resistance genes from the environment. That can be very hazardous. Every year we hear stories of someone who went swimming in a body of water. They had an open cut on their body. They developed a resistant infection. So antibiotic resistance is hazardous to humans from the environmental perspective, but it's very, very complex. We can't just say we're dumping antibiotics into the environment and making the problem worse. It's much more complex than that.